You're listening to this podcast, so I know you've got a curious mind. Here's a helpful fact you might not know yet. Drivers who switch and save with Progressive save over $900 on average. Pop over to Progressive.com, answer some questions, and you'll get a quick quote with discounts that are easy to come by. In fact, 99% of their auto customers earn at least one discount. Visit Progressive.com and see if you can enjoy a little cash back. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $946 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2024 and May 2025. Potential savings will vary.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Hello and welcome to this throwback episode of Our Fake History. My name's Sebastian Major, and right now the podcast is on a short summer break, so I'm using the opportunity to revisit some of my favorite episodes from seasons past. This week, I am throwing you back to the start of Season 6. What you are about to hear is the first part of a two-part series called What Went Down on Easter Island. I will be re-releasing Part 2 next week with a brand new introduction, much like the one you are hearing right now. Now, as many of you know, Season 11 ended off with an interview with the amazing American roots music visionary Rhiannon Giddens. Rhiannon was very forthcoming about the fact that she has been a long-time listener of Our Fake History. She pointed to this look at Rapa Nui, which is the indigenous name for Easter Island, as one of her favorite Our Fake History series. So, in honor of the wonderful Miss Giddens, I thought I would revisit it here. When this series first came out, I was really proud of it. I remain fascinated by the history and culture of the Polynesian Islands, so it was a true joy to explore the history of Polynesian exploration and migration more deeply. Now, one thing that I had forgotten was how this episode features some of the most famous names in the Our Fake History Rogues Gallery, or perhaps I should say infamous names. As you will hear, Graham Hancock, Eric Von Daniken, Jared Diamond, and Thor Heyerdahl all come up in this episode. Now, in this series, I am very critical of Thor Heyerdahl, and I very much stand by those comments today. Now, I'm not sure if I've spoken about this before, but the famous Norwegian adventurer was first presented to me as a bit of a hero. My parents had a beautiful coffee table book about the Kon-Tiki voyage that I loved as a kid. That book documented Heyerdahl's journey on a raft from Peru to the Polynesian Islands in the mid-1950s. Now, this stunt was meant to demonstrate the viability of his hypothesis that the Polynesian Islands were settled from South America westward, following the Pacific Ocean's Humboldt Current. The book was filled with these amazing photographs, which really sparked my imagination as a young person. In fact, I loved the book so much that I did a report on it when I was in like 4th or 5th grade. So, as an adult, when I learned that Heyerdahl was deeply associated with a pseudo-archaeological theory about a lost, light-skinned super civilization, that was very disappointing. He promoted a more respectable version of the so-called white gods myth, which has not only been thoroughly debunked, but has been shown to have caused all sorts of harm to indigenous communities the world over. Now, this was not something that I fully appreciated as a child. People have asked me before if I've ever had to bust a myth that I felt personally connected to. Well, Taking Thor Heyerdahl off his pedestal meant confronting my childhood fascination with this National Geographic mainstay. But one of the best things that came out of this series were the kind messages that I received from Polynesian people. I was happy to hear that many Polynesian listeners felt well served by this series and appreciated this critical look at the misconceptions about Rapa Nui. But I also received some important feedback. Now, back when I originally released this episode, I received an email from a listener of Hawaiian and Samoan ancestry whose husband had actually crewed on the Maori voyaging canoe Rapa Nui. That was a voyaging canoe built in the traditional style that he helped sail from San Diego to the Galapagos Islands and then on to Tahiti. This listener pointed out that while she appreciated this episode, she also wanted to add that so much of what we now understand about Polynesian migration came from the work of Polynesian people who over the last half-century did much to revive traditional seafaring knowledge. In her email, she pointed out, quote, the incredible amount of cultural restoration that has occurred in the last 50 years by Papa Mau, the Pacific Voyaging Society, and now generations of Polynesian wayfinders trained as master navigators using traditional methods, celestial navigation, end quote. She also pointed out that, quote, Polynesian scholars and cultural masters have spent decades proving the truth of our oral histories, our voyages of discovery, our own carefully preserved ike, that's knowledge of our sciences, end quote. To that end, she was uncomfortable with my use of the term mythology in this episode to refer to Polynesian sacred stories. This was a reasonable critique, as the term mythology can have negative connotations. But obviously, that was not my intention in this episode. As we have discussed before, mythology does not always refer to fake stories. Sometimes myths can contain deep truths. But I totally understood this listener's point. Her traditions have been ignored and denigrated for centuries. Polynesian oral histories were diminished as quote-unquote myths, and it stung her to hear that term used by me. But as you will hear, the big point that I make both in part 1 and part 2 of this series is that the traditional oral histories of Rapa Nui are considerably more accurate and enlightening than the harebrained theories cooked up by outsiders. Thankfully, this email was the start of a really nice dialogue between me and that listener. She helped me come to some deeper understandings about Polynesian people, the island of Rapa Nui, and Polynesian voyaging traditions. So, shout out to that listener. I hope she's still out there listening. Now, with all that said, I really hope you enjoy this throwback to episode number 116, What Went Down on Easter Island, Part 1. Enjoy, and please come back next week to hear Part 2 of this series, and tune back in on August 25th when we will be launching Season 12 of this podcast with an all-new episode. Here we go. Enjoy. In 1722, the Dutch mariner Jacob Roggeveen found himself in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Roggeveen was in command of a small fleet of 3 ships who were on a mission to open a safe westward route to the profitable Spice Islands near what is today Indonesia. By Roggeveen's time, the promise of a westward route to the Spice Islands had been animating European voyages across the Pacific for exactly 2 centuries. Ferdinand Magellan's chaotic and deadly circumnavigation, which concluded in 1522, minus a living Magellan, had been motivated by the exact same goal. Roggeveen's mission also had the added goal of discovering the legendary southern continent, known as Terra Australis. On Easter Sunday, 1722, after 2 weeks at sea since departing the western shores of South America, one of Roggeveen's lookouts spotted land. Perhaps this was the low and sandy island scouted by an earlier European expedition led by a certain Captain William Dampier. If so, that would mean that they had entered an island chain that would guide them on their way to the Spice Islands. But this island looked neither low nor sandy. This was a rocky island punctuated by volcanic peaks. It also seemed located too far to the east to be the previously scouted Sandy Island. Perhaps this island was something new. Perhaps it was the gateway to the mythical Terra Australis. What's more, plumes of smoke could be seen rising from the island. Clearly, it was inhabited. So Roggeveen and his captains conferred, and it was decided that the fleet would approach the island for closer investigation. The closer they got to land, the clearer it became that this was not Dampier's low sandy island. What they had taken for sand was actually yellowish grass that covered most of this largely treeless island. As they approached, it also became clear that the Dutch ships had been noticed by the islanders. The shore was crowded with hundreds of people looking curiously out at the European vessels. Some were even beckoning to the ships, making gestures that seemed to say, "Come ashore." But Roggeveen was cautious. Encounters between indigenous people and Europeans had not always gone well. So ultimately, it was the islanders that made the first diplomatic overtures. A single man in a canoe paddled out to the Dutch ships, ostensibly to make an introduction. The Dutch obliged him, and they brought both him and his small boat aboard one of their ships. The visitor had obviously come in peace, and to do a little exploring of his own. He looked around the boat with the genuine curiosity of a fellow mariner. Roggeveen would write in his journal that their guest from the island, quote, took special notice of the tautness of our spars, the stoutness of our rigging and running gear, the sails, the guns, which he felt all over with minute attention, and with everything else that he saw. End quote. Clearly, he was impressed by this craft, but notably not shocked or overawed, as indigenous stereotypes would have us believe. From there, Roggeveen tells us that they gave the visitor some beads, a mirror, and a pair of scissors, and sent him on his way. However, one of Roggeveen's officers, Sergeant Major Carl Friedrich Behrens, would record this first encounter in considerably more detail in his journal. He would describe the visitor's appearance like this, quote, he was very cleverly and regularly painted, with all sorts of figures. He was of a brown tint and had long ears which hung down as far as his shoulders, as if they'd been stretched to that length by being weighted. He was fairly tall in stature, strong in limb, of good appearance, and lively in mien, as well as pleasing in speech and gesture. End quote. The tattooed islander with his stretched earlobes obviously looked exotic to the Europeans, but it was also clear that he was there to establish friendly relations. So, they had a little party on the boat. They gave their visitor some wine. They gave him some European clothes, including a big Dutch hat that he didn't seem to like wearing. They feasted him with the best food on the ship. Then, according to Behrens, quote, after he had taken his meal, our musicians treated him to a specimen of each of their instruments, and whenever any person took him by the hand, he began at once to caper and dance about. We were much pleased to see his enjoyment. End quote. So, this meeting seemed fun for everyone involved. But it would turn out to be a prelude to much darker things. Despite the warm greeting offered to the Dutch by the islander, Roggeveen remained wary of the island. As the visitor from the island paddled back to the shore, he made a loud call. Barents thought that he was appealing to his gods. As he looked to the island, the officer ominously noted that, quote, "We could see great numbers of heathen idols erected on the shore," end quote. Now, what Barents called heathen idols, the people of the island called moai. These giant stone statues would become the island's most enduring symbol and the source of endless speculation by outsiders. You see, the Dutch had not discovered Terra Australis. They had instead bumped into the world's most isolated human settlement. The people of the island called their home Rapa Nui. The Dutch would call it Easter Island, in honor of the day they first spotted it. But right from this first encounter, the Europeans couldn't help but be fascinated by the impressive moai, some of which stood well over 20 feet tall. But they were suspicious. The Europeans had a hard time believing that the islanders, the Rapa Nui people, could have possibly created these statues themselves. Roggeveen would write, quote, "At first these stone figures caused us to be filled with wonder, for we could not understand how it was possible that people who are destitute of heavy or thick timber and also of stout cordage out of which to construct gear had been able to erect them. Nevertheless, some of these statues were a good 30 feet in height and broad in proportion." End quote. Indeed, the manner in which the moai were constructed seemed deeply mysterious, especially considering that Easter Island was largely free of trees. Roggeveen would posit his own theory that the statues were not made of stone at all, but instead clay. Now, this assumption was completely wrong and suggests that Roggeveen never got particularly close to any of the moai. This would begin a long and storied tradition of outsiders getting the moai and Rapa Nui in general completely wrong. Roggeveen's visit was also the first of increasingly disastrous encounters between Europeans and the people of Rapa Nui. You see, the day after the Rapa Nui islander visited Roggeveen's ship, the Dutch captain decided to make a landfall on the island. He came to shore with 150 well-armed men, who he immediately formed up into a military formation. The islanders came to meet them in a giant crowd. Roggeveen took the lead and started steadily marching his men forward. He hadn't gone very far before he heard a massive commotion coming from the back of his ranks. He heard one of his men scream, It's time! Fire!" Then the sound of muskets rang through the air. The frightened crowd of Rapa Nui onlookers ran away from the Dutch as fast as they possibly could, but not before a dozen of their countrymen were killed by musket balls. Roggeveen would be told by one of his men that the shooting had started when some of the islanders started threatening the Dutch with stones. But Carl Friedrich Barents, who apparently saw the incident with his own eyes, told a slightly different tale. According to Barents, the inquisitive Rapa Nui islanders started investigating the Dutch as they marched forward. Some islanders started to grab at the men's guns. One Dutchman got spooked and fired his musket. Then someone let out a call, and before long, a whole group of Europeans were firing. When Barents looked over the dead, he was shocked. There, amongst the fallen islanders, was the man who had visited his ship the day before. They had eaten together, danced together, and now the man was dead. This story of first contact may be one of the most heartbreaking I've ever heard. And that's saying something considering how dark so many instances of first contact often were. But there's something about this one. The fact that one of the victims was actually the guy who had been on the boat the day before, it's one of those truth is stranger than fiction moments. It's so darkly ironic, it seems like it was taken from a melodramatic screenplay. The Dutch would only linger on the island for 4 days before changes in weather convinced Roggeveen to weigh anchor and continue his journey west. Those 4 days would change the fate of Rapa Nui forever. Easter Day, 1722, may have been the day that Rapa Nui began its collapse. The fact that the world would come to know the place as Easter Island, well, that's just another dark irony. That is, of course, unless you believe that the civilization of Rapa Nui had already collapsed long before Roggeveen's fleet ever spotted the island. It's been argued that the people that Roggeveen encountered were just the remnants of a society that had been devastated roughly a century earlier due to an ecological collapse of the islanders' own making. From this perspective, the arrival of Roggeveen was just one dark chapter in a story that had been dark for quite some time. Turns out, the history and prehistory of Rapa Nui are among the most heavily debated in the world. It's been argued by the likes of celebrity geographer Jared Diamond that the Easter Island people were the unwitting authors of their own decline. By deforesting their island in the pursuit of bigger and better statues, they destroyed what had once been a flourishing and abundant society. However, recent research has cast doubt on this popular hypothesis and is making many reconsider long-held assumptions about Rapa Nui, its people, and its remarkable statues. But this debate has been further complicated by nearly 2 centuries of wild speculation about the island. Rapa Nui is pure catnip for researchers interested in quote-unquote alternative history. Giant mysterious statues dotting the shoreline of the most remote place on planet Earth. Oh, it's not long before someone says Atlantis and someone else says aliens. What should we believe about this truly unique and fascinating place? Let's get to the bottom of it today on Our Fake History. Episode number 116, What Went Down on Easter Island, Part 1. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast that explores historical myths and tries to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story it simply must be told. Welcome to Season 6, everyone. The immortal Abed Nadir from the much-missed sitcom Community once said that success in entertainment meant 6 seasons and a movie. Well, here we are in Season 6. It's an achievement. I hope you enjoyed the OFH throwback episodes that we did over the summer, but now we are back with all new shows until the summer of 2021. But before we can dive into today's very exciting topic, I have a few announcements. First, Dirty Church, the band that brings you the theme song for Our Fake History, has just released a new EP on Bandcamp with 4 new songs. So if you like the song that starts off Our Fake History, then you really need to check out this new EP. Full disclosure, and I've been coy about this over the years, I am in the band Dirty Church. I play guitar. That's me saying 1, 2, 3, 4 in the theme song. Many of you have already put that together, but for some of you, I know that might be a little bit of a revelation. So I was a big part in creating the music that's on that new EP, and honestly, I'm really proud of it. So if you dig what we do, please go to dirtychurch.bandcamp.com and download the new EP there, or go to dirtychurchmusic.com and check out all the cool stuff we have on offer. Now, if you're curious about what these new songs sound like, stick around to the end of this show. I will be playing a new Dirty Church song, so listen right to the end if you want to hear that. I'm actually going to be playing a new Dirty Church song on the next 4 episodes of Our Fake History. So listen right to the end if you want to hear some new, cool music. Finally, the other project I was working on this summer was my very special extra episode on the life and legend of the inventor Nikola Tesla. I ended up creating a nearly 3-hour beast of an episode on Tesla. He was trilogy material, but for my patrons, I went the distance and turned what could have been a trilogy into a big, fat, mega episode. So if you're curious about that episode on Tesla, and honestly, I think it's pretty good, then consider becoming a patron. To find a level of support that works for you, just go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Okay, enough preamble. Let's get to today's topic. We are starting season 6 by exploring a historical controversy that brings together a number of threads that I've been following on this podcast for years. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, as it's known by the island's original settlers, and that's the name I'm going to be using for the island going forward, by the way, is a place that outsiders have always found deeply mysterious. To be sure, there are a number of things about Rapa Nui that resist easy explanation. First, there's the very remoteness of the place. The subtropical volcanic island could not be more alone out there in the Pacific Ocean. The nearest point on the South American continent lays 3,512 kilometers to the island's east. The next nearest Pacific islands, the Pitcairn Islands, lay 2,075 kilometers to the west. In 1722, when the Dutch first encountered the island, they noted that Rapa Nui was a solid 2 weeks' sail away from any other piece of land. When Roggevin first made contact with the people of the island, the only boats he saw there were simple 1- and 2-man canoes, hardly suitable for long ocean voyages. So, one of the first questions people started asking about Rapa Nui is, how did the indigenous people get there in the first place? Over the centuries, people would cook up all sorts of theories to explain what seemed to be impossible. Next, we have the giant moai. You might know them more casually as the Easter Island heads. You see, many people thought that they were just big sculptures of heads because some of the most famous images of the moai were of statues that had fallen or had become buried up to the neck. Actually, those heads were on top of colossal bodies. A typical moai weighs 14 tons on average. These giant statues were positioned all over the island, often several kilometers away from the quarry where they were originally carved. These colossuses were perfectly balanced on ritual platforms known as ahu. Now, all this raises the question, how did they do it? How did a people working with stone tools carve, transport, and finally erect these marvels? This question is made even more puzzling by the fact that when Europeans first encountered the island, it was completely devoid of any substantial source of timber. It was virtually treeless. If they didn't have trees to use as rollers, sledges, or scaffolding, how did they possibly create these stone masterpieces? Well, as you might expect, this has led some to speculate that the people of Rapa Nui were not actually behind the greatest expressions of their culture. The questions around the moai have led many to fill in the blanks with all the usual blank fillers. A number of figures who you will probably recognize from past episodes of this podcast have weighed in on who they think really built the moai. There's our old buddy Thor Heyerdahl, who thought he could explain the arrival of people on Easter Island and the moai with his Viracocha theory, sometimes called the Kon-Tiki theory. That was that a light-skinned ancient super-civilization moved from Central Asia across northern Africa, then across the Atlantic, before founding the precursor of the Incan civilization in the Andes. Then that uprooted race of master architects fled west in boats from South America before landing in Rapa Nui and creating the moai. But more on that a little bit later. Then, of course, we have our reoccurring foil, Graham Hancock. Hancock believes that a handful of anomalous moai, or moai that look slightly different than the others, were not actually built by the relatively modern Rapa Nui people. Instead, they were the work of his mysterious, super ancient, long forgotten megalith building global civilization. The same civilization he believes brought us the Sphinx in Egypt, the giant Olmec heads in Central America, and pyramids the world over. Finally, there's Erich von Däniken, the infamous Swiss-German theorist who brought us Chariots of the Gods and basically gave birth to the ancient aliens theory. His take on the moai? Aliens did it. Simple as that. Just look at them. They even kind of look like aliens. But even more complex is the question of the island's supposed ecological collapse. When it comes to this question, there are fewer alternative thinkers weighing in, and instead we see very real disagreements between different reputable experts on the island. But if you will allow it, I'm going to set that question aside for now. In part 2, I really want to unpack the debate around the ecological collapse. But for now, let's get into where the first settlers of Rapa Nui came from and how they created their astounding stone sculptures. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Shopify. When I first started this podcast in 2015, I had a lot of people tell me that it wasn't a good idea. Believe it or not, even in 2015, there were people who thought that podcasts were already washed and I was making a huge mistake trying to start one up. Well, they were wrong. It's easy to get discouraged when starting a new business, but I'm telling you, it's worth it. If you've been sitting on a business idea, Shopify makes it easy to make it happen. Everything you need to start selling is included and ready from day one. All Shopify storefronts are integrated with a checkout, also called Shop Pay for free. Shop Pay is a one-click checkout, which makes it super easy for people to buy your stuff. Because Shopify handles the setup and checkout, you have more time to focus on growing your business. Shopify powers millions of businesses worldwide, from household names to small businesses just getting started. If you're ready to stop putting off your business and start hearing, then you're ready for Shopify. Start your free trial at shopify.com/fake today. You heard that right. Start your free trial today at shopify.com/fake. That's shopify.com/fake.
You're listening to this podcast, so I know you've got a curious mind. Here's a helpful fact you might not know yet. Drivers who switch and save with Progressive save over $900 on average. Pop over to Progressive.com, answer some questions, and you'll get a quick quote with discounts that are easy to come by. In fact, 99% of their auto customers earn at least one discount. Visit Progressive.com and see if you can enjoy a little cash back. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $946 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2024 and May 2025. Potential savings will vary.
The question of how the first people came to Rapa Nui has been the source of scholarly debate for quite some time. There are a number of hypotheses, but I think the best place to start is with the people of Rapa Nui themselves. What do the islanders say about their origins? Well, the people of Rapa Nui have an oral tradition that an ancient king named Hotu Matua brought them there from a faraway island. Today, the legend of Hotu Matua has been turned into a popular song sung in the island's indigenous language that acts as a de facto national anthem for Rapa Nui. The island is technically part of Chile these days, but it's not uncommon for islanders to sing the song of Hotu Matua right after singing the Chilean national anthem. The story of Hotu Matua goes like this. Long ago, the people of Rapa Nui had a different island home that they called Hiva. Then, one night, one of their great ancestors, a man named Haumaka, had a prophetic dream. In his dream, Haumaka's spirit traveled to a far-off island, a lush and beautiful land he called Te Pito o Te Henua, or the navel of the earth. When he awoke, Haumaka realized that the land he saw in his dream should be the new home of his great king, Hotu Matua. Haumaka then told Hotu Matua of his dream, and the king sent 7 scouts to head out across the ocean and find the dreamed-of island. The scouts returned and told the king that the island was real, and it was just as wonderful as Haumaka had described. So Hotu Matua and his wife put together a group of colonists and divided them between 2 large voyaging canoes. With the blessing of Hotu Matua, the legendary canoes sailed forth, following the path that had been determined by the 7 scouts. Eventually, they arrived at the navel of the world, an island that they would later call Rapa Nui. They pulled their canoes up at a place called Anakena, one of the island's few sandy beaches. There, Hotu Matua established his kingship over this new territory for all time. In many ways, the story of Hotu Matua follows a structure that's familiar across Polynesia. Many Polynesian islands have a mythical founder king who comes from a legendary homeland island and leads his people by boat to a new promised land. Listeners in New Zealand might hear a lot of similarities between the story of Hotu Matua and that of Kupe, the legendary ancestor of the Maori people. Now, I find it really fascinating that the mythology of the Polynesians quite explicitly points out that they traveled to their homes by boat. By contrast, the mythology of most indigenous North Americans is that they have always existed on that land. There's no tale of migration over the frozen Bering Strait. The Polynesians are like, no, we did not always live here. We came here by boat. Now, this makes sense when you consider how much more recent the Polynesian migrations were compared to the first arrival of people in North America. Polynesia was settled within the last 2,000 years, with New Zealand only becoming inhabited as late as 1200 AD. Most people believe that the indigenous people of North America first arrived on the continent between 20,000 and 35,000 years ago. That difference is reflected in the oral traditions. Now, the question is there any historical truth living inside the legend of Hotu Matua? Well, the cool thing is that most experts think that there probably is some truth to the story. The best research suggests that the ancestors of the Rapa Nui originally came from the Marquesas Islands, or the relatively nearby Mangareva Island. Linguist Stephen Fisher has pointed out that skeletal analysis between Mangarevans and the people of Rapa Nui show that the two peoples are quite closely related. He's also noted that linguistic studies have shown that the languages spoken on Mangareva and Easter Island are very closely related. So it's quite possible that the Hiva in the myth was actually Mangareva, or potentially a different island in the Marquesas. It's also been pointed out that the way the voyage to the new land was organized in the story was probably close to how it was done in reality. Back in season 1 of Our Fake History, I took a close look at the competing theories on how the Pacific Islands were originally colonized. That was episode 14. It was called Did Gods Colonize the Pacific? And I think it makes an excellent companion piece to the series you're listening to right now. So if you got some time, you might want to go listen to episode 14. Anyway, one of the controversies I explored in that episode had to do with the direction of migration across the Pacific. In other words, was the Pacific colonized from west to east, that is, from Asia all the way out to Hawaii and Easter Island, or from east to west, that is, from South America back towards the Asian continent? In the course of that episode, I did my best to explain the key pieces of evidence that prove that Polynesian people colonized the Pacific Islands from west to east. Their culture seems to have originated close to Asia in the west and then spread steadily east. Now, I'm not going to relitigate all of that here, so if you want to hear all of the evidence, which included analyses of pottery, linguistic studies, the analysis of the spread of domesticated animals, and both human and potato DNA, then you can go back to episode 14 and check it all out there. However, I have since learned a number of new things about Polynesian ocean voyaging that I think are super relevant here. Now, as you might remember, part of the secret to the Polynesian migration east were their truly astounding boats, known as Polynesian voyaging canoes. The design of these ancient voyaging canoes is somewhat mysterious. In fact, one of the best depictions we have of a voyaging canoe comes from a petroglyph found on Rapa Nui. But thankfully, the designs of these boats has been preserved through oral tradition. And in fact, in the 1980s and the 1990s, many Polynesians started reviving the ancient art of boat building. It's now widely accepted that these voyaging canoes weren't so much canoes as large double-hulled sailboats or catamarans. These boats could have transported up to 30 people each, maybe more. But most importantly, these boats could be sailed close to the wind. Now, I don't know if I've talked about this before, but one of my hobbies is sailing. I've been doing it ever since I was a kid. I actually used to teach sailing. So I'm going to drop a little bit of sailing knowledge on you right now. So no boat can sail directly into the wind. Their sails will not fill. You will be pushed backwards and your sails will just flap around. In sailor speak, this is called being in irons. However, a well-designed sailboat can sail on an angle very close to where the wind is coming from. This is called being close-hulled. By using a technique called tacking, a boat can then move in a zigzag path in the direction that the wind is coming from. If you can do this, you can sail in all sorts of directions. You're not just getting pushed to wherever the wind is blowing you. If you can tack, you can navigate. The Polynesian voyaging canoes could get on close-hulled courses, and the sailors knew how to tack. Now, what's cool about the Hotu Matua myth is that it gives us some insight into how one of these massive journeys would have been planned. A group of colonists wouldn't just load onto a boat and hope for the best. Their final destination would have been predetermined by scouts who would have been sent out ahead of time. Now, the last time I looked at the history of the Pacific, I didn't know about these scouting expeditions, but they actually help explain one of the most puzzling things about Polynesian migration. If you've listened to episode 14, then you might remember that the prevailing ocean current that extends from the coast of Peru and flows all through Polynesia is called the Humboldt Current. That is the ocean current with the most mentions in the history of this podcast. Comes up more than you might think. Now, the thing about this ocean current is that it flows from east to west, from South America across to Asia. It's like this big watery conveyor belt right around the equator that moves everything from east to west. So, when the main ocean current goes from east to west, it seems counterintuitive that human beings would have fought against that current and migrated from west to east. Why were these ancient Polynesians literally going against the grain? This seemed so counterintuitive to the Norwegian theorist and adventurer Thor Heyerdahl that he came up with his own elaborate theory that colonization had actually occurred the other way around. In his estimation, early settlers came from South America and followed that very handy ocean current east. But more on Heyerdahl a little later. But the scouting system helps solve this riddle. It's now the scholarly consensus that these early Polynesian scouts weren't just drifting around and accidentally bumping into new islands. Instead, voyages of discovery were thoughtfully planned expeditions. Stephen Fisher describes them like this, quote, "The initial discovery of an island was customarily accomplished by well-equipped scouts on two-way exploratory journeys. The scouts would set out with a given amount of food, sailing close to the wind. If no land was found by the time half the food was consumed, they returned to their home island, easily sailing downwind. End quote. I will add that not only were these scouts sailing downwind, but they were also being pushed home by the current. So going against the current, heading east, gave you an easy journey home. The way out may have been a little tough, but if you ever got into trouble, you always knew the way home was going to be easy. So it isn't counterintuitive after all. It actually makes good sailing sense. I love that. The myth of Hotumatua gives a mythical nod to this process. It also then explains the follow-up journey of the two voyaging canoes loaded with colonists. Now, in reality, there may have been far more than just two canoes, but in general, that part of the story matches what scholars see as the reality. Once again, I'll use Stephen Fisher to describe what one of these journeys would have looked like. He tells us, quote, "The settlers' canoes carried all the necessary foodstuffs, plantings, domesticated animals, pigs, dogs, poultry, sacred stones, images of deified ancestors, and many other items. Each carried up to 30 or more settlers, many of whom were tufunga, a Polynesian word meaning canoe and house builders, tool makers, expert carvers, priests, orators, and so on, and a large complement of women of childbearing age. In other words, each settling canoe held a complete Polynesian society." End quote. It would have been canoes like these that would have brought the first people to Rapa Nui. If those settlers had indeed left from Mangareva, the trip would have probably taken roughly 17 days. Now, exactly when they arrived is a bit more controversial. Our earliest radiocarbon dates of human artifacts found on the island suggest human occupation as early as 700 AD, or maybe the mid-600s. However, linguistic analysis has suggested an arrival as early as 300 AD. Then there are other researchers who suggest that the evidence of material culture on the island points to an arrival date as late as 1200 AD. Like many things with Easter Island, it's controversial. But the vast majority of sources I have read seem most comfortable with the 700 to 800 AD arrival date. But despite all this excellent research into the oral traditions of Rapa Nui and how they align with what we know about Polynesian migration, there are still fringe theories out there about a group of settlers on Rapa Nui that actually predate the Polynesians. According to these theorists, like our old buddy Thor Heyerdahl, it was these mysterious early inhabitants who really built the impressive Moai statues. So let's take a little break, and when we come back, let's take a closer look at that particular theory.
Every day as a small business owner feels like solving a puzzle. One moment you're cruising along, and the next, there's a shipping snag that has you scrambling. But here's a surprise you will like. With Progressive, small business owners save 13% on their commercial auto insurance when they pay in full. So go ahead, surprise yourself. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
One of the things that has fueled speculation about Rapa Nui for centuries is its uniqueness. Not only is it geographically isolated, but the culture of Rapa Nui can appear quite distinct from even its closest Polynesian neighbors. It's been argued that no other Polynesian island has anything quite like the Moai. Whether or not that claim stands up to close scrutiny, we'll evaluate down the road. But for now, let's allow that, at least superficially, the culture of Rapa Nui can seem unique, even anomalous, to use a word often employed by Graham Hancock when he's talking about the island. This uniqueness has for a long time been part of the so-called Easter Island mystery. The one person who was most associated with the investigation of this mystery was Thor Heyerdahl. Now, as I've already mentioned, we have looked quite closely at Thor Heyerdahl's life and theories on this podcast before. I will once again direct you to episode 14 for a thorough going over of Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition. That was when he captured the world's attention by sailing a raft made of pre-Columbian Incan materials from Peru all the way to the Polynesian island of Rauroya. But if you don't have time to listen to episode 14 right now, then let me catch you up. Thor Heyerdahl was a beloved Norwegian adventurer and academic generalist. Now, even though Heyerdahl would eventually earn a litany of honorary doctorates, he was notably not a PhD in any particular field. But despite that, during his lifetime, he became one of the world's best-known public intellectuals. This was mainly due to the daring stunts he would pull to test his theories about human migration and anthropology. These included multiple transoceanic trips on boats that were meant to mimic the technology available to various ancient peoples. National Geographic loved this guy and would often document his various adventures with colorful photo essays. But even though almost all of his theories have since been demolished by the wider academic community, he is still fondly remembered and was even buried with state honors in the Oslo Cathedral when he died in 2002. But with that said, Thor Heyerdahl is perhaps more responsible than anyone else for the slew of misconceptions people have about Rapa Nui. You see, in 1955, Thor Heyerdahl organized and led the Norwegian archaeological expedition to Easter Island. Now, I don't want to make it sound like this expedition was entirely bad. The team, led by Heyerdahl, was staffed by a number of excellent archaeologists. The research they did into the Moai and the material culture of the island was legitimately groundbreaking and contributed quite a lot to our understanding of Rapa Nui prehistory. But Heyerdahl himself drew some pretty wild conclusions about the island. He published these ideas in two very popular books, 1957's Aku Aku, The Secret of Easter Island, and his follow-up, more than 30 years later, 1989's Easter Island, The Mystery Solved. Over the course of these two books, Heyerdahl laid out an alternate history for the island of Rapa Nui. He argued that there were clear aesthetic similarities between the Moai of Rapa Nui and the large anthropomorphic stone statues found in Peru, specifically statues found at a site known as Tiahuanaco. Heyerdahl believed that the people who lived at that Peruvian site were eventually forced from Peru and fled across the Pacific in boats resembling his Kon-Tiki Raf. Now, the part of the story I didn't get to back in episode 14 is what happened next to those Peruvian refugees. Well, Heyerdahl made the case that by following the Humboldt Current, those exiled Peruvians eventually hit Rapa Nui and became its first settlers. He argued that these settlers from Peru were remembered by the islanders as the Hanau Ipi, which sometimes gets translated as the long ears. Heyerdahl also observed that in the historical record, there seemed to be a marked change in the island's culture between Jacob Roggeveen's visit in 1722 and the 1774 visit from the famous British navigator Captain Cook. Heyerdahl noted that the society observed by Roggeveen seemed to be peaceful, the population seemed healthy, crops were bountiful, and the religious worship associated with the Moai seemed to be flourishing. Heyerdahl also pointed out that Roggeveen and his men had observed that many of these islanders had long, stretched earlobes. He also insisted that this group of islanders were light-skinned, and we'll come back to that. By contrast, when Captain Cook visited the island 50 years later, the population seemed smaller, and instead of serenity, everywhere there was evidence of discord. Cook would record this in his journal while describing observations made by one of his scouting parties. Quote, "On the east side, near the sea, they met with 3 platforms of stonework, or rather, the ruins of them. On each had stood 4 of those large statues, but they were all fallen down from 2 of them, and also one from a third. All except one of the statues were broken by the fall, or in some measure defaced." End quote. So, according to Captain Cook, by 1774, many of the island's great moai had been toppled over or vandalized, seemingly on purpose. Heyerdahl had a theory about all of this, because, of course he did. He believed that Jacob Roggeveen and Captain Cook had in fact encountered 2 different cultures on Rapa Nui. He believed that Roggeveen had met the light-skinned long ears, or Hanau Ipi, and Cook had met the dark-skinned short ears, or Hanau Momoka. While on Rapa Nui, Heyerdahl also learned of a legend about a war between these 2 groups. The story told of a desperate struggle between the short ears and the long ears that culminated in a decisive battle at a place known as Poike Ditch. According to the legend, the long ears dug a defensive moat at the Poike Ditch and filled it with kindling. During the uprising, Heyerdahl claimed that the long ears ignited their moat and retreated behind it. But the short ears found a way around it, came up from behind, and pushed all but 2 of the long ears into the fire. According to Heyerdahl, the short ears then set about destroying the religion and material culture of their adversaries, namely the Great Moai. It's a tantalizing theory because, it sounds so epic. A master race of long-eared builders who bore their arts from the distant Andes, clashing with their short-eared rivals. It sounds like it's straight out of Lord of the Rings. Can't help but think about the elves. But this theory has all sorts of problems. Heyerdahl's belief that the people encountered by Roggeveen were somehow ethnically distinct from the Rapa Nui people of Cook's era isn't supported by much. First, there's the skin color thing. Heyerdahl was really hung up on skin color. He was very invested in the white gods trope that we have explored on this podcast before. He believed that where you had myths of light-skinned gods, you actually had evidence of his lost civilization of megalith builders, whom he thought were light-skinned. This is easily the part of Heyerdahl's theory that has aged the worst. While Heyerdahl would claim to be a friend to indigenous peoples the world over, this part of his theory just reeks of racism. So, where is he getting this from? Well, Jakob Roggeveen did make a handful of ethnographic observations about the islanders in his journal. Specifically, he notes that the islanders had, quote, pale yellow or sallowish skin, end quote. Heyerdahl took that to mean that the islanders were light-skinned. Now, this ignores the observation from Behrens that I quoted in the introduction that tells us that the islander he met on the boat had, quote, a brown tint, end quote. Honestly, to me, both of these descriptions sound like the tan skin tone of many Polynesian people. But Heyerdahl thought that Roggeveen's pale yellow people were a completely separate ethnic group from the islanders he encountered in the 1950s. Secondly, Heyerdahl makes a big deal about the early descriptions of islanders having long ears. But it's important to note that the practice of ear stretching did not go away by the time of Captain Cook's arrival. In fact, many islanders were observed with the distinctive stretched ears well into the 1800s. The long ears were clearly not erased from the island after one climactic battle. But beyond that, many experts have since pointed out that the terms long ears and short ears are actually mistranslations of the original Rapa Nui words. Linguist Stephen Fisher has argued that the words are better translated as stout people and slender people, which seems less indicative of two separate ethnic groups. Next, there isn't really any archaeological evidence that suggests that a battle took place at Poike Ditch. Now, there is evidence that there was fire there in the late 17th century. There are no human remains, no broken weapons, none of the archaeological residue that usually accompanies warfare. There's certainly no evidence of a huge mass of people being burned alive. As for the legend of the war between the stouts and the slenders, if we go with that translation, this has been more convincingly explained as a memory of class conflict or of clan conflict as opposed to a war along ethnic lines. John Flenley and Paul G. Bann have argued that the stout or well-adorned people, hence long ears because they've got cool earrings, were the ruling class on the island, whereas the slender people were the working class farmers. They were short-eared because they weren't wearing jewelry. In a moment of turmoil, perhaps the elite lost their legitimacy and the lower classes rebelled against the upper crust, including the priests, hence the toppling of Moai. Another explanation is that these two groups were actually competing family or clan groups on the island. Stephen Fisher, who I've been referencing quite a bit, has suggested that this story actually refers to a conflict between clans on the island better known as the Tu'u and the Otu Iti. However, the dating of that particular clan conflict is controversial. While Fisher is comfortable dating the intra-island clan warfare to the late 1600s, there's a competing theory that this legend is actually more recent. In the 1860s, the island was thrown into immense conflict after slave raids from Peru nearly destroyed the island's entire population. Groups of Rapa Nui people that managed to return to the island from South America often found themselves in conflict with the islanders who had not been captured. Some think these conflicts are actually the source of the myth. So it's hard to say exactly where this story comes from. But it seems very unlikely that the long ears were an ethnically distinct group from South America. Furthermore, it's also extremely unlikely that these South Americans built the famous moai. This is further evidenced by the clear connection that the moai sculptures have to the traditional religious practices of Polynesia. It can seem like the moai are completely unique and totally without precedent, but that isn't exactly true. You see, almost as important as the great moai were the ceremonial platforms they were placed on. These platforms were known as ahu. Ahu are very similar to ritual complexes found all over Polynesia. In fact, the word ahu is used on other Polynesian islands to refer to ceremonial altars. In Hawaii and on the Marquesas Islands, similar altars are usually home to wooden figures meant to represent important ancestors who are thought to have spiritual power. According to the Rapa Nui people, the moai serve the exact same function. Each of the moai represents a very specific deified ancestor. Every moai has a name, and some of those names seem to have been brought to the island from other parts of Polynesia. As a German observer would note in 1892, quote, "Even today, every older Rapa Nui man knows well the name of each of the many idols, whether standing or fallen, and he shows great respect to the same." End quote. This is to say that the building of the moai actually fits well with traditional Polynesian ancestor worship. The moai reflect something known in many Polynesian islands as mana. Mana is a type of spiritual power that can be possessed by an individual. Your mana was both thought to flow from your ancestors, but it could also be enhanced if you yourself performed great deeds. This power both existed while you were alive and lingered on after you had died. The moai were thought to contain the mana, the powerful spiritual energy of the ancestors. As Stephen Fisher poetically puts it, quote, "The moai were mana turned to stone." End quote. In other words, these giant stone statues were not imported from a South American civilization. They were a deep and profound expression of something that was very Polynesian. Now, even though I've just thrown some cold water on Heyerdahl's theory, just this year, in 2020, a study was published that has put him back in the news. A new genetic study seems to suggest that there is pre-Columbian South American DNA in the genomes of people from Rapa Nui. What does that mean? That means that there probably was contact between South America and the island after all. If this study is correct, then that means that well before contact with Europeans, islanders were heading to South America, or potentially vice versa. Now, this actually fits with some other research that suggests that Polynesians, in their excellent voyaging canoes, had actually made trips to South America well before European contact. This is based mostly on Polynesian-looking artifacts that have been found in southern Chile. But even with all of that considered, it still seems highly unlikely that an entire culture was booted from the Andes, ended up in Rapa Nui, built the moai, only to get booted once again. There's just too much evidence that connects these statues to the islanders who came to Rapa Nui from the West. But while Heyerdahl was wrong about a whole lot, he was right to notice that at one point, something significant changed on Rapa Nui. There was a point in the history of the island when it went through a calamitous upheaval. But the question is, was this an ecocide or was this a genocide? Okay, that's all for this week. Tune in again in 2 weeks' time when we will wrap up our investigation of Rapa Nui. Before we go this week, I want to let everyone know that there is some brand new Our Fake History merch at tpublic.com. If you want to link to our store at tpublic.com, go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the link. That's just way easier than me laying out the entire web address right now. It's super complicated. Go to ourfakehistory.com, click on the link to buy t-shirts, merch, and more. We've got a number of very cool designs from season 5 that are up now, including the much-loved Plague Doctor design and the new Tesla design as well. All of that is courtesy of our amazing artist, Frank Fiorentino. Before we go this week, I need to give a shout out to a whole lot of very special people. Big ups to Marcus Metzer, to Jim Stout, to Amy Sophie, to Lycia Gassama, to Ryan Nobles, to Danielle Steen, to Brendan Baquet, to Per Lofberg, to Marcus B., to Eric Kinder, to Abby Broombaugh, to Jenna Person, to Andrew Glover, to Scott Russell, to Shale Lewis, to Jacob Grisham, to Josiah Pruis, to Jonathan Wilson, to Taylor John Jakes, to Julie Evanson, to William Yorey, to Liz and Andy Madpair, to Annie Hamill, to Joe Giovanoli, to Kitty Taylor, to Nikhil Sitter, I hope I said that correctly, to Depresha Turner, to Paul Young, to Hangatu Wild, to Marco Hladnik, to Matthew Ambrogi, to Joseph Harder, to Brandon Schrader, to Amin Osman, and to Alvaro Sanchez. Whew! All of you folks have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon. So you know what that means. You are beautiful human beings. Thank you so much for your support. If I missed anyone, or if you have, for some reason, not heard your name on this podcast and you are pledging at the $5 or more level, please reach out to me. Sometimes I miss people, and it's a pure accident on my part, and I just want to make sure I make it right. So let me know if you have not heard your name. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, you can send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory, or you can reach out on Twitter at ourfakehistory. As always, the theme music for our show comes to us from Dirty Church, but we've got a very special new Dirty Church song for you to check out today. So I'm going to send you off with the first track off the new EP. It's called the Last Supper EP, and this song is called We're Not Dead Yet. It's a song for our times. All right. As always, my name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real. Sister Judy told me that the die is cast. All the gold is gone, the best days in the past. Guess that holding on, it isn't holding fast. Nothing lasts. Told her we ain't going down without a fight. Gonna scream our names into the coming night. When the darkness falls, you got to shine a light, shine a light. Make it right with me, yeah. 'Cause we're not dead yet, we're not dead yet. We're gonna make the best of what we got left. Yeah, we're not dead yet, we're not dead yet. We're gonna make the best of what we got left. Apocalypse. Shake your hips. Said, baby, do the apocalypse. Shake your hips. Said, baby, do the Omega Man. Clap your hands. Said, baby, do the Omega Man. Clap your hands, 'cause well, we're not dead yet. We're not dead yet. We're gonna make the best of what we got left. Yeah, we're not dead yet. Not dead yet. We're gonna make the best of what we got left.
Hello, and welcome to Pluto Phone. If you know the name of the movie you would like to see, just stream it for free on Pluto TV, where all your blockbuster favorites are landing all summer long. Catch Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy.
Fantastic.
The Matrix Trilogy.
Welcome to the real world.
Mean Girls.
Shut up.
Titanic.
I'm the king of the world.
And so much more. For showtimes, press nothing. They're free 24/7.
That is so fetch.
On Pluto TV. Stream now. Pay never.
The moment a body is found, the clock starts ticking. 48 hours before the trail goes cold. From A&E and Crime House, this is the official podcast from the famous true crime series, The First 48. I'm Carter Roy. Every Thursday, I revisit a landmark homicide investigation in depth with long-form storytelling built for your ears. Listen to and follow The First 48 on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
As a small business owner, sometimes it feels like no matter how much planning you do, there's always surprises, like an urgent, expensive repair. But here's a surprise you will like. With Progressive, small business owners save 13% on their commercial auto insurance when they pay in full. So enjoy a surprise for once. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.